Hello there. Welcome to the CG Cookie live stream. I believe I'm just gonna verify that I am live. Update the chat. Hello there. All right. Actually, I don't think I need to do that. All right. So it looks like we are good and in order. Awesome. So yeah, welcome. Today we are going to be looking at sculpting in Blender, another project-based stream. And let's see, it's fall now, it's October. I've got a nice cup of hot apple cider. Leaves are changing, the weather's getting colder. It's a really fun time for me in October, and also for Tim, for a short while, resident concept artist. He loves Halloween, and we're going to be sculpting this little goblin critter that he drew up for his like Drawloween, I think is what he calls it. But should be a really fun character to sculpt, and it's got a couple challenges that I maybe haven't ever done as a sculptor yet, and it's also celebratory of Halloween and the season. So I think it'll be a lot of fun. Now, before I get started, I'm still trying to figure out the project-based streams. I've done one already where I sculpted my kid's head, but I think in hindsight, I think it got a little bit boring. We saw viewership go down a little bit, suggesting that it wasn't quite as engaging as I had hoped. And so I'm trying to figure out how to improve this approach. And the thing that I keep coming back to is, as an instructor, and especially an online instructor, I feel like I have the need to explain every single thought that's going through my head as if you've never opened Blender before. And that ends up being a lot of repetition. If I use the inflate brush 1,000 times in a sculpt, it really is lame to repeat that 1,000 times. So that's a very small example. But so what I'm going to try and do, an experiment for this month, it's going to be a series of streams to sculpt this character. I'm going to experiment with just trying to keep it a little more casual, trying to resist the urge to assume that you know nothing about Blender and therefore say everything that is going on in my head. I'm going to try and keep it, I want to try and open it for it to be directed by you. Ideally, you will see what I'm doing, pick up tips along the way. I'm certainly going to say something, along the way that I think is relevant information. But I also want to leave the door open for you to ask your questions, to direct me so I can give you the information. We can hit the information that's most relevant to you in that moment, rather than this just be a live version of our recorded content, because that's not at all the purpose of this. So just with that prefaced, don't be surprised if there's some quiet, if I'm just repeating a certain step and I'm kind of quiet. I'm going to have some background music going so it's not purely awkward. I'll go ahead and start that back up. If it's too loud, let me know. I think I got the levels pretty good. But yeah, okay, so with that prefaced, let's go ahead and get started. About 4 minutes into it. All right, so let me switch my window here. Here we go. So starting in Blender, I've already created a scene and set up a few objects. We've got a camera with our Goblin artwork, which maybe we can take a closer look at here. Really cool creature. One of the challenging things that I don't think I've ever done is the extremity of volumes in the mesh. So for example, like the shoe and the ankle almost become like hair thin, whereas the head is enormous. And those two volume extremes make for a very intriguing character design. And it certainly obviously works with pencil and paper. I'm curious. I think it will be awesome, but I've never actually done that in 3D. So that's going to be an interesting challenge. Another challenge is going to be Tim has this really wonderful tactile ability with his pencil sketching in particular to capture this texture and high frequency detail all over the surface. Now that doesn't necessarily translate well to a sculpture. For example, like sculpting all these little frizzies on the pants. That's not really something you would ever sculpt. It would be hair follicles later. But, I want to, so I'm going to have to simplify a lot of the structures. Whoops. But I want it to still be authentic. I don't want to make it into like a Disney character that's way too smooth and simplified. But that is one of the challenges as well, trying to figure out where to hit the detail, but also where to bypass it and maybe leave it for another stage or just not do it at all. That's kind of a couple of the challenges that I know going into it. I say challenges, but it's just an exciting, different thing I haven't done quite yet. So awesome. I've got my UI set up pretty typically where most of my work will be done in the 3D view over here, and sorry. So most of my work will be done here, and then in the bottom right, I've got my camera with the artwork, and that's going to be where I judge my sculpture according to the artwork. All right. I've already been talking a lot. Haven't really held back anything yet. So I'm going to start with the skin modifier. I think that's a good way to approach this sculpture rather than polygon modeling a base mesh, because I'm going to be sculpting the character in pose, and that is that's going to be tricky. And so to pose a base mesh, skin modifier I think is the best way to approach that. I'm going to just delete everything but one vertex, and then add that skin modifier. And please, if you've got questions, let her rip. I do have the chat open here. I'm going to keep an eye on that best I can. Awesome. So we have the skin modifier added. I also want to add a subdivision surface on top of that. I just like to see a smooth version. And also when I start sculpting, I like more geometry rather than less geometry. Maybe even smooth that twice. All right. So we'll start right here from the camera view. Actually, I'm going to move this vertex to be flat on the ground and flat on the x-axis, right about here. All right, now I'm going to maximize this view, and let's start proportioning and blocking out some of the structure. I'm just going to start with the foot here. Start building up these shapes. And then with proportional editing on, I can Control A and kind of gradually affect all of the verts around the selected vert, which is pretty cool. I want to turn that off and then scale this all the way, Control A all the way down, make it very sharp. Cool. All right. Let's extrude to the ankle. Make our way up the leg. Looks pretty good. Go back super small again for the ankle on the other side. Same deal, use proportional editing to gradually change the thickness of all these points. Man, there, as I zoom in, I'm always struck by just how far he pushed these extremes. It's really cool. I think it's an awesome part of the character design. It's just, you know, obviously breaking some rules anatomically and just very different from what I typically sculpt in 3 dimensions. All right, I'm going to start the spine, send it up this way. I can't really see what's behind the candy corn, so I'm sort of guessing at this point. Okay, so we've got a decent start. And I've drawn everything from this camera angle, so it's very flat at the moment. If we leave this view and look in the perspective, you can see the pose is completely wrong once we look from the side view. And so I need to pose everything a little bit differently. And this can be a little tricky because I want to respect the camera angle because that's matching, but I need to make the pose sensible in 3D, in the perspective view rather. So I'm going to move in the y-axis because that won't change much from the camera's view. And let's just try and offset this character's orientation. So by moving those legs either way, now we've got him sort of at an angle. And then let's see here, thinking through a pose and what like a run looks like, I think it's a good idea to move the foot back this way, maybe rotate it in Z. There we go, something like that. And similarly, let's move the knee out this way. Okay, it's starting to feel like a pair of actual legs now. Okay. But now that I've done this, the gap between like authentically matching the artwork, that's going to increase, and I just want to keep an eye on it. I'm not planning on it being perfectly identical because you know, a lot of things in 2D are cheated once you start creating it in 3 dimensions, and that's fine. I just, you know, it's matching, it's hitting that balance of authenticity between the 2 dimensions. So, Michal, you asked, are you Xeroxing this? And no, it's not going to be a Xerox, but it's going to be pretty close. I rehearsed this a little bit earlier because I didn't want to come in completely blind to this. And as I rehearsed, there was enough discrepancy trying to make it make sense in perspective compared to the artwork that I did have to compromise in order to make it look the best. So not going to be a Xerox, but it's going to be very close to that. All right, so the legs are looking pretty decent at this point in both 2D and 3D. This foot maybe is a little bit smaller than this other guy, but it looks good in the artwork. So this might be a place to break the artwork, away from the artwork and just increase by scaling these vertices, kind of increase the size of the foot, just to make them relate to each other a little better. But I'm happy with that for now. Let's continue moving on up the spine, into the shoulders. I'm going to go back to our camera view, looking in wireframe, and let's see, the skin modifier is giving me trouble here. Let's see, I'm going to delete that point and maybe moving it up. There we go. All right, let's create some shoulders. Scale them down, and then begin creating the forearm, upper arm, and then the forearm. Also create the other side. We're going to quickly run into the same issue of orientation once we look at the perspective. But let's just block out the shape. That's important to get first. Yikes, that's looking weird. Maybe go ahead and extrude a neck up there. Okay, let's look in the perspective now. Ooh, that's looking weird. Okay, same idea as the legs. Let's move these backward. By backward I mean in the y-axis, and then move the other arm forward. So we're starting to match the orientation. Let's see if we can't alter the size of some of the shoulders here, so that our geometry is not quite so busted. Right now it's just looking awful. And so sometimes I have to succumb and kind of submit to the skin modifier because it's just a little unwieldy. And so, like, for example, on the shoulder, that's obviously not the ideal shape, but it's the best geometry for sculpting, and so I'll leave it at bad shape, but better topology. All right, let's let's also continue with the head. This enormous, enormous head. And let's see here. Cut a new edge. Go ahead and extrude out for the nose. See, this kind of shape is pretty funky. Look at that. Getting a weird gap in there. Let's see here. Maybe I need to Alt-M merge those. Maybe not. Very, very strange right now. I really don't like that it's giving me a gap. That's a real problem. Okay. Maybe let's change the orientation, see if as we reproportion the head, if we look through the camera, keep in mind that his head is at an angle, and that's just what we're trying to match. Let's see if we can't extrude, whoa, whoops. Just take this single point and extrude out an ear shape. Control A to scale that way down. And I'm complaining a lot about the weird geometry that we're getting from the skin modifier. So whenever that happens, it can help to adjust the skin root. If we mark a different object, a different vertex as root, it can change how the geometry is generated. Sometimes that can solve a problem. Sometimes not so much. I wonder if that vertex doesn't need to be there. Geometry is just so weird. Like, it's almost unusable. That's kind of what I'm worried about. Did not experience this bad in rehearsal. Okay, that looks workable. Let's hope that we can just leave it at that. And go back to trying to figure out where our head needs to be positioned. I do think the head needs to be pushed forward. Let's see. Let's look at the artwork. When in doubt, go back to our art. We got a recommendation in the chat about, let's see, turn off X symmetry. I don't think I have any X symmetry on right now. Yeah, I don't have any mesh symmetry going on, and there's no mirror modifier. So no symmetry. Oh, okay, that's what you mean. X. There you go. Oh, that's a big help. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. In the chat, Sabi404. Yeah, that was a great suggestion. Turning off. Oh yeah, brilliant. All right, I'm going to turn that off. Maybe that will make this a lot easier. Let's see here. Maybe I can get rid of that vertex too. Yeah. There we go. That's going to outline my shape better. That was a great suggestion. Appreciate that. All right, so this, let's see. If we move this ear up to match our artwork, it looks really, really strange in the 3D view. Like, that might be something that we need to kind of neglect entirely. I don't know how to make that not look weird, because in perspective it seems to be somewhat symmetrical with the other ear. It needs to be pushed down like that, but it's obviously not matching the artwork at all anymore. So this is one of those areas where it was hard to Xerox, like impossible to Xerox. So I kind of decided to go ahead and break from the Xeroxing and keep it making more sense in the perspective view. All right. There we go. All right, so we're starting to get somewhere. I'm liking how it's turning out so far. I want to bring the shoulders up a bit. And it's probably a good time to introduce this piece of candy corn that the Goblin's carrying. Because what's also going to complicate this character is the fact that there's other objects that he needs to interact with. So that'll involve switching, between objects as we sculpt. Maybe scale this down a little bit. All right, so I'm going to do that with a different object. I'm going to add a cube and just polygon model this very simply. Let's take these front vertices, scale them down. This could be as simple as just doing this. And add a subdivision surface modifier. Crank that up to 2 at least. Alright, so we've got a stand-in piece of candy corn. How does that match the proportions? That's pretty good. Looks good in camera view. Now let's make sense in perspective. It's got to orient to the body, so I'm going to rotate it like that. Also rotate it this way. Yeah, that makes the most sense to me. And how's that still holding up? Whoops, in the camera view. Let's scale it in the z-axis. Whoops, scale it in the x-axis locally. There we go. Cool. And all right, now let's make the arms match, or respect that new geometry that we've added. So that elbow is going to, pinch the candy corn up into the chest, and I think we're probably venturing pretty far away from the art. So let's try and get back to that. Let's see here, the neck and shoulders, I moved those a little too high. All right, that looks good. Maybe I need to rotate this candy corn because it's penetrating into the arm a lot. That's pretty close. All right, but this back arm, his right arm, is not really anywhere close. We don't see much of that arm, so we have freedom to kind of do whatever we need to make sense of this shape. Or, I mean, the pose, rather. Alright, it's looking good. He's starting to resemble the character as he's running off with this piece of candy corn. Alright, now let's create the fingers, because they are going to play an important role for this pose. I'm going to do it in the camera view first. I think that's the safest bet. Just begin creating the shapes. They're very simple to create with the skin modifier. Basically extruding from a singular point in the hand, scaling way down. And by scale, I mean Control A when you're using the skin modifier. And from here, we'll go to the perspective view, start to create some fingers in a gripping pose. So, question for the chat, is anyone else working on Halloween-themed projects this month? Curious if you are, and if so, what kind of project? And if you've posted it in the CG Cookie Gallery, a link would be swell. I personally love the moodiness that comes with October. I have a certain set of movies that I like to try and watch every October, but I have a pretty quirky, maybe particular, quirky is not the right word for it, but particular opinion of what a good Halloween / October movie is. So maybe I'll describe that, and I'm always up for suggestions to anything that fits this criteria as I create this guy's other fingers. But my criteria is, I'm not a big horror fan, so I don't like, gore and killing kind of just for the sake of being scared. I really need there to be kind of a psychological element going on, something, even like spiritual, for example, and I guess I needed a reason in the head to like be freaked out, not just like raw scare tactics, I guess. Anyway, so some sort of psychological element, but my favorite atmosphere or setting is in colonial times, and usually I'm not necessarily America, but since I'm born here, like I think of history a lot in American terms, and like that colonial period. So the Crucible with Winona Ryder and what's his name, Daniel Day-Lewis. That's a really good example of, has the creepiness, it has the setting of being like pre-colonial times, I think, Salem, whatever, really early, and that's a good example. Another one is Sleepy Hollow. So that, in my opinion, is a perfect Halloween movie. So if you guys know any that are creepy, they take place in colonial times, or at least it feels like that. Another one that I love is Nicole Kidman in The Others. That one is actually like World War II era, but the house is really old and they dress kind of old-timey, and so that totally fits. But if you're aware of any of those movies, I'm always open to hearing or to seeing new ones in that realm. But I know that's pretty specific. I've done a lot of research and feel like I kind of tapped them all out. But anyway, sorry, that was a weird rabbit trail. Just in honor of October. All right, so I'm trying to wrap up these fingers. I personally hate fingers. I think they're just a lot of effort for a very repetitive kind of small payoff. I don't know too many people who get a big kick out of, oh man, look at those hands on that character. That's so cool. That was worth studying the character for a while. So there's not much payoff, but it does take a lot of work to get hands looking decent, hands and fingers. So I do not like doing them, but they kind of have to be done. All right, I'm coming pretty close to being done with these guys. And with this one being on the back side, not terribly important. But still, I guess I shouldn't say that. In the end, I want this character to be viewed from all angles, so it does kind of become important. And then we'll match what we've created to be closer to our artwork. Maybe I'll just pick the entire hand and move it up. Another thing with posed characters is the blockouts certainly are a little more time consuming. And if you're like me, blockouts are not the exciting part of a sculpture. All right, let's call that done with the fingers for now. Wow, this other one is huge. So that's just wrong. That's an example of how I was trying to match the artwork really closely, but it created a significant problem in the perspective view. So sometimes I'm just going to I'm going to favor the perspective view. All right, I think we're at a decent spot for the blockout. See, that only took about 20-25 minutes. Is there anything that I'm missing? I don't think so. I think this will be good. So we got a question from Matt Dickon. What is the benefit of using the skin modifier versus just modeling the body like you do the candy? Yeah, fair, absolutely good question. So the candy is a very simple object. Having worked with, once you get comfortable, not that you aren't, but when you get comfortable with 3D, you kind of develop an understanding of simple shapes like this can be created mainly from just simply modifying a cube and then adding a subsurf modifier like I did with this. But in the case of a character, you end up extruding a lot of limbs, and that's just not as intuitive because you'd be worrying about multiple vertices for each part of the character. And with the skin modifier, you can just worry about one point, and that represents a pretty substantial amount of geometry. And so for characters and complex structures, I guess, I like to use the skin modifier, but for simplified shapes like the simple candy corn, I can just create that simpler with a primitive, modifying a primitive. Omar, I see what you say about the skin modifier, and yes, it is also faster. Well, a lot of times things that are simpler are faster as well when it comes to 3D stuff. And that's another reason for me to do it this way. Let's see, so I'm just gonna maybe once over the pose, try and make the most sense out of it. It's not gonna be perfect because the sculpture is gonna evolve and the pose will evolve with it as we go, but I just wanna feel really good about the pose because it's the easiest to change the pose with the skin modifier before I go into actually sculpting things. So I want to make sure I like the orientation of the head. I think that does look and feel pretty good. And I'm not even touching the back portion yet, this little, I don't know, pouch or something, whatever that is. The pose is not affected at all by this object, so I'm just going to leave that and add that later. But since the candy corn does affect the pose, I want to include that now rather than later, since it does just affect it so directly. All right, I think this is good. I like the pose. I think I feel comfortable at least saving it. I should be saving a lot more often, but all right. At this point, we've got a good base mesh, and I'm going to hit Alt-C to convert a mesh. Well, I'm going to choose the mesh from curve, meta, and surface text. This just essentially serves to collapse our modifier stack. So now we've got a piece of solid geometry that is perfect for sculpting. Excellent. Let's see. One thing I like to do before I go into sculpting, or I know I'm going to do eventually, is I'm going to select a different layer than what my object is on. I'm going to make a different layer active so I don't see the sculpture anymore. The point being that I do see the artwork very clearly. But now if I hit the tilde key, which is to the left of, or which is above the tab key on your keyboard, that will enable all layers. And so when I set it up this way, I can very quickly on and off, let's see, there we go. I can turn my sculpture on and off very quickly, not having to hit Command H or anything, just hit the tilde key twice to turn it on and off. And that's good because with the sculpture on, I can't see the artwork clearly. And then going into wireframe doesn't really serve much purpose when sculpting, so I like to use that little trick. Though it seems I have to do it in this view in particular. When I do it over here, it resets to whatever layer has an object. It's kind of interesting. I didn't know that. All right. We're ready to begin sculpting. Let's jump into sculpt mode. I'm going to switch over to my pen, and hopefully this process will get a lot more interesting and fun. We'll start to see the character pop out. And I'm going to start with the head, just because that is one of the most defining features on the character. And I want to build up the brow shapes. especially. Like that's, he has very defined brows. Oh, I also need to turn on dynamic topology. Pretty standard practice. I like a detail size to start at 10. Subdivide, collapse, relative detail, all that's good. I'm just going to inflate the majority of the head and try and match the volume over here in the artwork. Oh, also, by default, symmetry is on in the X direction, and we have no symmetry. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get both sides for free. Well, one side for free. So we're just gonna have to do that the old-fashioned way, as if we were sculpting with clay. Each side together. That's also another challenge of this kind of character. Then I'm just going to build up a brow shape. So build up a mass first, then maybe rough in some, using my crease brush, I always like to make the default behavior add so that it matches the rest of the behavior. And I mean, it's funny, as I hear myself say that, I know I've said it, gosh, half dozen times in other recorded training. So I wish that I could, like, I don't know, not repeat that stuff, because most of you have probably seen that stuff, and it's just a waste of time. It slows down the process. But man, I've so trained myself to say every little thing that I'm doing. But anyway, just trying to figure out this whole live stream business and how to do it well. All right, let's rough out some shape around the eye, kind of build up an ocular cavity. Also a cheek. It's going to be important. It looks like I have a lot of room to expand down here for the mouth before it starts resembling the artwork well. So let's do that with my mask brush. I'm just going to mask out a portion. See a comment. The first thing I do when I download a version of Blender is change all those settings and make that my default startup file. I do too. I actually have two versions of Blender that I have installed. I have a working version of Blender, which is what I do any non-recorded training stuff with. And then I have a version of Blender. Let's see, I want to redraw that actually. I have another version of Blender that is my record version. And so that one has the default theme, a lot of default settings, just because it forces me to get into the context of someone who's watching a tutorial, and if they're newer rather than experienced, it forces me to have to change those settings so they can see it. And it's kind of that weird space of like, is this necessary? It's annoying to say the least, but I think it's a big disconnect for less experienced users. Change my detail size to 5 when I pull out this jaw portion. It's a big disconnect for new users to see like a different themed version of Blender and all these default settings changed. So anytime I record, I typically jump back to like the factory settings of Blender for teaching purposes. But yeah, I mean, it's a lifesaver for my personal workflow that's not being recorded to be able to save a startup file. I'm gonna switch back to detail size of 10. And let's just flesh out the bottom jaw now. That was a big part of the face that was missing from the skin modifier. I think that was just a hard shape to create with the skin modifier, so I assumed it would be easier later. All right, let's do that tilde hotkey, kind of feeling out where my mouth is in relation to the art, and we're pretty far off. Actually, I need to move a lot of this backward. And in order to do that, let's see, what's the best way? Maybe smoothing all of this backward. I also need to, I'm going to mask out the area of the mouth that'll be open, and I need to create a mouth cavity. So this is a particularly tricky part of the character because very confined space, which can be hard to deal with in 3D. So that can take some practice to get comfortable there. But what I'm going to do is kind of the same thing I did with the mouth. Let's just grab our snake hook brush with this area masked out. Go into wireframe view. Let's pull this geometry back and create for myself. Let's see, I'm going to turn off, oh no. I was going to turn off front faces only, but that's not even on. There we go. So I've started a mouth cavity shape. Alt-M. Let's clear the mask, and then let's get tight in there and inflate. Ooh. But be careful because, yikes, it can start to get real weird. Maybe I should not have unmasked quite yet. So this is going to be a delicate dance of inflating, but not too much, and solving any problem geometry. Am I still using? Yeah, okay. And by zooming out, using relative detail, my geometry will become broader, and that can help in situations like that. Okay, so we've got a mouth cavity now. And that's going to be important for the anatomy to make sense. That's Alt-M to clear the mask. Hit the tilde key to... Okay, we're much closer now. Much closer, with the mouth at least. But look how far off our eye is. Whoops. The eye needs to be brought way down. And with it, the brow as well. So let's just, since we don't really have an eye shape yet, we'll just bring the brow down. But we can use the inflate brush to kind of rough out an ocular cavity, and that can give us the impression of where the eye is going to be. But that is kind of ugly. Sometimes an ocular cavity by itself is good enough, but then other times I'll want to, let's see, use the fill brush to kind of block in an actual volume of an eye. Something like that. Yeah. Ultimately, I'm going to put a sphere in there, a separate sphere object to represent the eye, but right now it's going to be less hassle just to like rough out a shape. All right, let's see if we're closer to the art using the tilde. Okay. Still need to bring the brow down and the eye volume as well, or at least the bottom of the eye. It's kind of squished, so let's pull that down. Cool. I think that's looking a lot better. And it's always good, you know, to match the artwork, but also keep in mind the symmetry. Look how off the symmetry is at the moment, where the brows are very different angles. So let's bring this side back. The nose isn't really pointed straight down the face. It's kind of cockeyed. And if you're like me and usually use symmetry, it can, you know, we can be spoiled with the symmetry, and trying to do that manually can be like frustrating. But it's a good exercise, good to get out of your comfort zone and learn new approaches, new techniques. Just trying to rough out his angry brow a little bit better. Let's give it some more volume, because I think that's certainly apparent in the artwork. Mine are kind of flat. All right. Yeah, this is progressing fairly well. Those ears are going to be fun to shape. Looking forward to that. Maybe bulbous out the eyes. Just creating verbs over here. Bulbous out. Let's give it some cheek definition because he's got this kind of evil smile going on. And yeah, I don't know why all of a sudden it struck me, but I saw some comments about the artwork being really cool. Completely agree. Tim, he's quite the talented artist. And if you checked our blog today, he posted about the fact that he's going to be leaving us. This is his last month full-time with CG Cookie, and that's certainly very sad. I kind of like Tim. I consider him a friend now, after years of working with him and hanging out with him. So I'm definitely sad to see him go, but practically speaking, he will still be involved with CG Cookie, and you know, if we need artwork for a course or for anything that we're doing 2D hand-drawn stuff, like he's the first person we're gonna get in contact with. That includes creating other courses. We'll just reach out to him on a contract basis rather than him be with us full time. So he will still be involved with us. It's not a clean break forever. Not if I can help it. Not as long as I'm here, but we are gonna miss him. So he is a talented bloke. I don't know if I've ever said that so naturally in conversation. All right, let's look around this guy's face. Let's match it with the artwork, see what it's doing. Okay, so we're building up some good anatomy, but he's not smiling. That's a big problem. So let's go to my grab brush, switch the curve to be this kind of pointed fall off. Is the pot going to be sculpted? Oh, I think that's the thing on the back of his, kind of like a backpack. Maybe that's a pot. I kind of interpret it to be like a leather pouch of some sort. But yeah, that definitely will be sculpted. I mentioned that earlier in that since it's not directly affecting the pose of our character, I've opted to just keep that separate, not even worry about that yet. And then after I, sculpt these things, the main bits of the character, the body and this candy corn, I'm going to go back and add the pot or the pouch, whichever it actually is. All right, so let's figure out the smile. Right now it's looking pretty funky. Not feeling like a smile, not looking like a smile. I think I probably need more features with which I can compare it to the artwork. One thing is this needs to be pointed and not so round. There we go. Also, what about his lip? How far out does that need to go? Oh, whoops. Turn that on and off with tilde. All right, so still we need to pull this down. Switch back to a smooth fall off. I guess I should be doing this from the artwork. And here you can see why wireframe, whoa, accidentally maximized the properties panel, but why wireframe is hardly useful within sculpting dynamic topology. Whoops, I want to go back to there and use the tilde trick. And I'm just going to take some time to really match up the features that I have with our art. I've been spending a lot of time in the perspective view, which is fine, but could be beneficial to Xerox first, get it, now that I have a lot of features, Xerox it first, and then go back into the perspective view and make it sensible there. And the extremity of these features, like further pulling down the cheek here, it feels so weird to me, but I think it's a really neat distinguishing part of the artwork. Just when I'm kind of making assumptions in my sculpture strokes, it ends up being nowhere near as extreme as it needs to be. Just a reminder of how fun the design is. All right, we're getting pretty close from the camera angle. Now then, we need to smooth out the nose, better shape that. Just using the smooth brush here, along with grab. It's really wobbly right now. Oops. But it's starting to feel like the character, which I'm excited for. Oh, I just noticed something. Maybe the orientation of our head is not quite right. Looks like the brow, this brow needs to be forward. And so if I rotate the entire head, I think we could accomplish that. Let me tab into edit mode. Marquee select the head. And I always do this. I make my selection first before placing the cursor where I want it. So I'm going to hit A and then C and select vertices around the neck. Shift S, cursor to selected. That places the cursor in the middle of the neck, or whereabouts in the middle of the neck. And Control Z to go back to my original selection, because Control Z does not respect where you place the cursor. So now I want to rotate around the cursor, which is placed at the neck. And let's do this from camera view. And if we do that and then move the head, that gets us a little closer. Was that in Lord of the Rings? Let's see, the character maybe? I think you're talking about? Oh wait, I'm sorry, I missed another comment. I immediately think they have a cave troll. Sorry, I was just catching up with that bit of chat humor. That's pretty awesome. All right, does that look a little better now? Yeah, I think so. I think that yeah, now there's room to bring down these features. Yeah, that was good. That was a good choice. The whole head is kind of squished on this side, especially the eye. All right, let's see what that looks like. Yeah, that looks good. Nice. That looks a lot better. So I match. You can see how cockeyed it gets when you just depend on the camera view. It's just trying to bring that nose out a little bit. Sends it out of whack pretty good, out of alignment. And I'm keeping an eye on the symmetry. You can see that clearly we're not symmetrical. And I feel like maybe the upper lip is part of the reason we're not symmetrical. We see a lot more on this side. It's just tricky doing symmetry on your own. Have a lot of respect for clay sculptors, traditional clay sculptors. And good Lord, can you imagine sculpting like marble like they did back in, I mean, I assume they still do it today, but like especially the Renaissance sculptors, stuff like that. Gosh, how in the world did they do symmetry back then? Okay, something's feeling a little weird about this area. I don't know if it's just, again, the extremity of volume that I was talking about. Let's take a look at the artwork. Now this feels a little bit too far down. Oh, there's not enough volume on the bottom of the head. While I'm at it, let's go ahead and smooth out the neck connection, because remember that was some pretty busted geometry. the music stopped. All right, sorry, start that up again. That's feeling better. This lip shape's a little wonky. All right, cool. Let's now, we've spent a lot of time on this side of the face, but obviously because that's our point of reference to the artwork, but we've neglected the other side of the face, and symmetry's all wrong, the anatomy is falling way behind. So let's spend some time getting that up to speed, using what we've kind of familiarized ourselves with on the other side of the face. We should be able to apply some of the same principles on the on this side that's not seen by the camera. All right. Let's see here. Looking at the symmetry again, pretty big discrepancies in that department. Need to build up a cheek shape. There we go. All right. Just that change alone really helps it out. I just saw that John Crawford in the chat asked, I noticed most of the sculpting stuff here uses dynamic topology. Is it ever practical to sculpt without it these days? Yes, that answer is a definite yes. I have found that if you're not sculpting dynamic topology, for those who might not know, you're going to be sculpting with multi-resolution most likely, and that's kind of the other format with which to sculpt. And that was the only method back in the day, similar to ZBrush, where it's just subdividing the mesh and sculpting using that new geometry. If you need more detail, you subdivide it again and sculpt on that new geometry. Dynamic topology came around, and that enables you to kind of have infinite clay. That was the name of the first iteration of the tool. I think that's what it was called. But and so I like dynamic topology for, kind of sculpt sketching, where, which is kind of what this is going to be. I'm just, I'm not planning on using this, turning it into an actual animatable character. It's just for sculpting. And that's great for dynamic topology. But if I was in one of our courses, the sculpting what's it called? It's one that came out based on a workshop. Hold on a second, let me find that real quick. It is called, I should know this, Modeling a Realistic Character with Blender. If you watch that course, it is an advanced course, but you see that how I like to use dynamic topology to create the essential structure. I think it's much more flexible, and the base mesh isn't as important, whereas with multi-resolution, a base mesh, if it's a bad base mesh, can really hurt your ability to sculpt with multi-res. Not the case with dynamic topology. It's very freeing. Just sculpt to your heart's desire. So that's why I like to use dynamic topology for especially starting out a sculpt. But then when you want to go to the really high levels of detail, that's where multi-resolution comes in. So you dynamic topologize a sculpt to about 50 to 70% of your finished sculpture, retopologize it, and that gives you that same 50 to 70%, but just in good geometry form. And then you add a multi-res to create all that high frequency detail, because Blender handles multi-resolution detail better than it does dynamic topology. So a 4 million polygon mesh will run smoother as a multi-res object rather than as a dynamic topology sculpture. So yeah, that's kind of a long way to answer your question. It is very relevant to still use non-dynamic topology sculpting. That I certainly do it myself. And then let's see. Okay. Omar was also helping out with some advice in the chat. Thank you, Omar. All right, so where was I at? Yeah, trying to regain symmetry, build that in a little bit better, add some definition to this proxy eye just because it's lagging behind compared to the other side. And yeah, we've made strides in that department. It's looking better symmetrically. So that's kind of a principle that I try and get in the habit of. Don't neglect any certain part of your sculpture for too long. You know, if I had just stayed on this other side of the sculpture, I know I've said this like 100 times, but if you stay on that other side of the sculpture and sculpt that too far, then it's just a little bit harder to get back on this side. So I recommend touching the whole sculpture before like going to level 2. All right, so this is looking pretty good. Let's address the ears. What time is it? So I think I said like an hour and a half in the for this live stream in the description. So we got about another half hour or so, making decent time. All right, so with my snake hook brush, this is going to be perfect for pulling out. I need to increase the detail size. Let's go down to 5. And that's going to be perfect for dragging out this shape of the ear. Smooth is going to be good for getting that fine level of volume there, that really thin volume. Also keep in mind that smoothing your mesh does not increase the geometry count when using dynamic topology. Turning that on and off, we can see that the ear is still overall too thick. So just using my, I was trying to use smooth and that wasn't really working. Let's take inflate brush to decrease the volume. Check that. All right, that's looking a lot better. And now it's just sort of a what do you call it? Like a spindle, kind of like a horn coming out the back of his head. We need to create that inner cavity to represent to actually look like an ear. So I'm going to mask out a portion. I'm going to take my time with the mask, make sure that it matches the artwork. Got to bring it further down. Nice. I think that's looking pretty close. Just kind of always keeping an eye on this right side so that the mask fits within the confines of the art. All right, so with that drawn out, we can control I to invert the mask, and let's inflate. Also go back to a detail size of 10. I don't want too much geometry. Might have been a bad idea, actually, because it got really funky up here. John Crawford, you are absolutely welcome. Thanks for asking a question. I always feel like when I'm just talking in a live stream, just explaining my workflow, it's never as valuable as actually people asking questions. So you can have that one-on-one time sort of with me to ask the questions. But in a way, thanks for asking. I really think that I just feel like it's a waste if these streams kind of are a live version of our recorded training. I just don't think that that's really valuable. This needs to be an interactive time with you guys. All right, I think we've got a cavity accomplished fairly well. I'll go back to this harsh edge and just, you know, push it out, bulk it out with the inflate brush. Turn that on and off. Ooh, it's actually pretty ugly over here. Turn that on and off with the art. You can see that we got to make some changes to the shape. Oops, not tab. Okay, it's looking a little better. I also might be concentrating a little too much. I don't need to be this perfectionistic quite yet. Still a lot of things to kind of do level 1 basic sculpting before I concentrate so much. Very cool. Let's save this file before it crashes on me. Question from Coco0. Can you show the brushes you switch to? The left pane is scrolled down. Absolutely. 90% of the time I'm using grab, inflate. Let's see here. So we got grab, which is the G key. We've got inflate, which is the I key. And the crease brush, I use that. That's Shift C. And that's like 90%, just those few brushes. You've seen me switch to the snake hook brush, which I don't think has a hotkey, and so I always pick that one manually. But yeah, let me go over them again. Grab, inflate, crease. I think those are the only ones I really switch to. Pinch occasionally. I haven't done much pinching at all here yet, but I will end up using pinching. But yeah, just a handful of brushes, and I find that I can do like all of the work with those handful of brushes. All right, so moving on to the other ear. Actually, let me see if anything else needs to be defined. Yeah, okay. So this edge right here, you can see that that's pretty bad. I'm going to use my crease brush to kind of round out the back side of the ear. Okay, it's looking a lot better. This is the crease brush with Shift C. Nice. Yeah, I like that. All right, so when it comes to the other ear, John's saying, glad to hear you enjoy the questions because I have a lot. That's great. Yeah, primarily I think this should be a place to ask questions and for you guys to contact me or whoever's doing the live stream to be able to ask those questions. You can ask questions in the recorded content you know, on the site, but who knows if that's going to be answered that day or in a week, whatever. So yeah, definitely ask your questions. How does the Blender workflow differ to ZBrush? I'm guessing you prefer ZBrush like most sculptors. Actually, I don't prefer ZBrush. I own a copy of ZBrush because that was the back in right when I got out of college. That was the first thing I bought. I use ZBrush all the time. Thought the world of ZBrush and still think very highly of it. But it was also fairly cheap and offered unlimited like updates and stuff. But I bought that, so I own a copy. But I haven't had to use ZBrush for any sculpture task since then. I have played around with the Q remesher. So I've been in ZBrush for that reason. That I did that a couple years ago. But no, I haven't had to use ZBrush. I've never run into a task where I'm like, Blender just can't do this. I mean, sure, I'm not sculpting like billion polygon sculptures or anything like that. And I know ZBrush can touts that, you know, they can do that pretty well. I personally don't know why you need to sculpt that high, but Blender, I use that over ZBrush right now. I've never had to do any different. How does it differ from ZBrush? ZBrush is more fully featured. There's a lot, like, it's like sculpting in Blender but on steroids. I just have found that I don't really need the steroids very often. So I also haven't used ZBrush seriously in years, but back when I used it, ZBrush didn't have any kind of dynamic topology, and I could be wrong, but I don't think it does have an equivalent. I don't think it has an equivalent to dynamic topology in Blender. I think it has like a remesher tool where you can very quickly, like, you know, regenerate all the geometry on your sculpture, and they have Q remesher to kind of auto retopology a little bit. But correct me if I'm wrong, anyone in the chat. I don't believe ZBrush has an alternative to a true equivalent to dynamic topology. So Dynamesh is what I was talking about. I've seen videos where they sculpt and sculpt and sculpt and then like drag their tool. Their has something to do with like clicking and dragging the tool, I think, and it dynameshes the model. It's like the remesh modifier in Blender, and so it takes the geometry. Like, think of Spider-Man like spraying his web on the character to create an all new topology at whatever resolution they want, and then they can keep sculpting from there. So it's like kind of like a remesh. It's basically the remesh modifier. But I do not think that it dynamically generates topology as you sculpt. I don't know, it's been a couple years since I looked into ZBrush seriously, so I could be wrong about that. Please correct me, anyone, if I am wrong. But as far as that, my ZBrush workflow transferred very, very well over to Blender. And I've never really needed to go back, so, you know, I think it has the reputation of being a professional software, and people assume that it's, by and large, does so much more than Blender, and Blender can't even really keep up. But I don't know. I'm kind of proof that I've always used just Blender stuff since transitioning to Blender. Thank you for that answer, Mark Smith. I appreciate that. All right, so I've just been looking at this ear for a while. We're in an interesting spot because, remember, I broke the connection to the artwork just believing that this looked better down rather than awkwardly like shoved, pointed upward. And so I'm just kind of going to make this up because I don't have really any artwork to support what this shape should be at this angle. So I'm just going to have to make it up again, referencing what I've already done on the other side. Definitely want to obviously shrink the volume. All right, it's looking pretty good. We've already done the back of the ear, so I think it's probably a good time to do that mask where we mask out the shape. And I'm just going to eyeball it compared to the other side. That should get us close enough. All right, yeah, I think that's pretty good. Control I to invert it, and we'll go into the inflate brush with the I hotkey, holding control and pushing in. Just going back and forth from pushing in, smoothing out. Just want to keep this shape as smooth and not jagged as possible. Cool. All right, Alt M to clear the mask. I think that looks pretty good. As a rough out of the shape. And just same thing I did on the other side, using the inflate brush to build up a little lip around a softened inflated edge. and then I'm going to use some of these shapes, just try and reverse it in my head. So you can see that this is trying to correlate to the artwork down there, or rather my sculpture that's over top of the artwork. Alright, I think that's a decent rough out of the head. Cool. I feel like I'm making better progress than I did with that first project-based stream, if any of you guys were there. Also, if you have feedback how I can improve, like I'm very, very malleable right now, trying to figure out a good way that resonates with you guys to do these live streams, to make them the most valuable. So please post any feedback, like do the music sucks, or get a different accent or something. I know that could be hard to actually apply, but anything. Would you like to see certain types of topics? To me, sculpting makes the most sense. You know, it would be unbelievably boring to like block out an animation, I feel like, or rig a character. Can you imagine? Or like, you know, try and troubleshoot a dynamic simulation. So sculpting seemed like still seems like the most obvious thing to do during live streams, but I've thought about doing like a traditional polygon modeling of like an excavator, you know, like a big heavy machine. There's just so many parts, it could be a fun exercise. But yeah, if you've got any suggestions, I would love to hear them. And I think I saw a question. Is it not possible to apply symmetry to just the head? No, and if you're familiar with ZBrush, maybe that's something that ZBrush can do. To my knowledge, I can't. I could have done that if I how would I say this? I would have needed to create a base mesh for the head that was symmetrical by itself, and then rotated it into position, and then sculpted that using its local axis of symmetry. That could have been possible, but because I blocked out the entire character using the skin modifier, I can't. Actually, now that I'm saying that, you bring up a really interesting concept. I've never thought of this before. So just bear with me. I've only got about 12 minutes left. So if you got any last minute questions, please ask them and I'll get to them before we turn off for the day. But so could I do symmetry on just this guy, on just the head? And where my head went was like, sure, let's say basically taking the axis of symmetry, the local orientations from another object, applying it to our character according to a certain type of a certain place, a certain part of the body. So let's say I added let's do a Suzanne monkey head, since that'll be a little more obvious. I rotate this object to match orientation of what the head should be, okay? Also try and get the center of the head lined up perfectly. Let's say it's that. Now I combine this object to the Suzanne head, Control J. If I hit GXX, that now moves in that axis. So tab into edit mode, Control L, and delete the Suzanne head. Delete all the parts of the mesh. And now if I turn on, in sculpt mode, turn on symmetry, in theory, I'm sculpting symmetrically. But that's entirely based on how perfect I aligned those orientations. But if I did that early on in the process, yeah, you could totally sculpt symmetrically that way. That's blowing my mind. I've never thought of doing that. And so let's say I sculpt the head symmetrically, and then I want to go down to, I don't know, the foot. If I wanted to do that symmetrically, I just do the same process, add a new mesh, line it up to the orientation of the foot, combine it, delete the unneeded mesh, and sculpt the foot symmetrically. That is a fascinating approach. Never thought of that before. That's really cool. I'm gonna have to seriously think about applying that in my workflow. Let's see. I'm trying to catch up in the. Okay, I see an excavator sounds pretty cool. That's something I don't do that often. Traditional polygon modeling, so maybe that'll be the next project. Let's see. So, Kesroy Martin, Jonathan Limpel sent him to a course about character modeling. That's great. John Crawford, I guess separating the head on the high-res model isn't practical. It's fine to do that. I've done that before. If you watch my robot character modeling course for games, I did like model most of it in separate pieces, having its own local orientations, specifically so that I could sculpt it symmetrically depending on the different object that I was on. So yeah, that's not impractical. But since that's a robot, it has very obvious, disconnected portions, whereas like an organic character like this, it's all connected. And so my default approach is to leave the base mesh all connected. Wow, that was a really fun discovery. Using a different object to adjust the orientations. That's cool. I hope that answered your question. Always good to hear new things. Yeah, cool. I think that's all the questions. I think I'm caught up. All right, so about 8 minutes. I might be to a place where I can go ahead and rough in the eye shape. I'm pretty happy. Let me just once over the head again. Whoops. Yeah, the head shape is pretty good. I'm happy with that. So let's go ahead and add the eyeball geometry. With my inflate brush, I'm just going to push that cavity back in to make room for the eyeball geometry that's coming in next. Oh, yikes. Oh, so I'm still sculpting symmetrically. But since the head isn't perfectly symmetrical, it would be a lot of work to get back to symmetry. Oh, wait. No, it wouldn't be. Symmetrize. Holy smokes. Look at that. I get a very clear picture of how symmetrical it is. Fascinating. The problem is, to my knowledge, I cannot limit the symmetrize option to just a certain part of the mesh. It does the whole thing. Which you can see really messes stuff up. But if I had done that early enough, that totally could work. Anyway, I'm a little too late in the process, so... I mean, if anyone can correct me, I don't think that you can limit the symmetrize to a certain part of the mesh. Wow, that's genuinely like a golden nugget of sculpting technique I've never considered before. So thank you for that. All right, so I've got my eye cavities kind of roughed in. Let's create some geometry with a UV sphere. Pretty simple. Also, trying to think how I can kind of distinguish where the pupil will be. At least going to rotate this 90 degrees in X. And then maybe I'll just bevel this edge. Control B. Increase the segments and then just push this. Let's see, turn off proportional editing, something like that. When I add a subsurf modifier, there we go. Maybe that can serve as the eye and the pupil, or the iris. I guess this character doesn't really, it has a cross for a pupil, but not really an iris. Nice. That's pretty cool. So Kezroy's asking, do you model characters? I think that's directed at me. Yes, I definitely do model characters. Maybe you're wondering, do I model like animation ready characters? And yes, I absolutely do. We have several courses on it. The Intro to Character Modeling course by Jonathan Williamson. I've got the Robot Modeling course, Realistic Character Modeling course. Also Sculpting the Wrangler, just to name the ones off the top of my head. But yeah, I definitely do model characters. You've been trying to learn Blender for over 2 years. Have you been doing that 2 years with us? Because we would love to help you out. That's a long time to still try and learn maybe character modeling. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe send a intercom. Like if you see the little orange, it's actually a big orange icon at the bottom right of the website. It looks like a talking quote box. I'm sorry, not finding my words. Submit a ticket there. Ask, like, can you point me to how I want to be a character modeler? Are you a beginner? And we'll be able to point you in the right direction if you're wondering that. Based on the question, I'm kind of getting the impression that maybe you're new to CG Cookie. John Crawford, I think sculpting is great for streaming because it's fun. There's a huge amount of depth to it. One other thing I think would be interesting to stream would be complex rigging. Holy cow. Yeah, I mean, maybe so. Maybe so. That is pure problem solving at its finest when rigging is. So maybe that would be fun to watch. I'm a little skeptical, like watching paint dry a bit, but I don't know, maybe we'll give that a shot. Let's see, trying to get this eye shaped and positioned right. Seems like I need to pull that a little closer. I'm gonna, let's see, only be on for another 3 minutes or so. Actually, that's looking really good. Nice. How does the scale of the eye match? A little small. Okay. Let's check that again. It's also a little too high. All right, that's pretty close. Now that I've got it positioned fairly well, it looks good from this angle as well. Now I can depend on that position a little better and kind of build up the face shapes around that. Man, look how little room there is between the bottom of the eye and the mouth cavity. You can see it, in a legitimate, well, in reality, that probably wouldn't work out. It works out in a concept art form, but not in three-dimensional space. So interesting. All right, so I think I'm gonna kind of pause there on this project. Definitely save it. I think we made a decent amount of progress. I'm glad I focused on the face because I'm feeling that character come through. And I've talked a lot about how there's a balance. I need to be motivated and feel rewarded by this work session rather than bummed that it didn't turn out the way I wanted. I'm actually happy with this. It leaves me motivated to pick it up again later, and I find that to be pretty important. All right, maybe another last question. Retopology could be interesting too. I'm not sure how much it's covered in the character tutorials. Haven't had to look at those yet. We actually cover retopology pretty extensively. We're big fans of the sculpt first, retopologize afterwards approach. So we do teach that a lot. Maybe I will do some retopology. I mean, I'm bound to do it at some point, whether it's a stream devoted to retopology or just it's modeling and I happen to be retopologizing stuff. Thank you, Mark. I'm glad you think that way too. It changed my world when I realized I didn't have to box model everything. Absolutely changed my world. So cool. I think we will save the file one more time, and I don't see any more questions. So thank you so much for watching this stream with me today, and thanks to John for asking some questions that inspired a pretty cool technique discovery, I feel like. That was pretty fun. I'm going to keep this project going through the rest of October, at least once a week. I've been tempted to do maybe a couple in a week, you know, keeping it casual still. But if you have any feedback, please leave it in the chat. How we can improve in the stream and how we can maybe hit more, you know, if there's more relevant information to you than others. Just anything that we can go on to improve. But yeah, have a good rest of your Wednesday, and I will see you in a week at the latest. All right. So see you guys. Have a good one.